All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on VMware Cloud Foundation. Really going to focus on those key concepts you'll need for the 2V0-11.25 exam.
Yeah, sounds good.
You guys sent over a ton of great study materials, a lot of practice questions. Our goal here is to go beyond just the what of those questions and really dig into the why.
Right, yeah.
So you come away with a rock-solid understanding of this technology, not just for the exam, but for really using it out in the world, like a cheat sheet for what really matters, you know?
Absolutely, yeah. Whether you're prepping for that cert or you're just looking to level up your VCF knowledge, or maybe you're just curious about like the nuts and bolts of modern cloud, right?
Yeah.
We're going to unpack all the essential concepts using those practice questions you sent as our guide.
Okay, so let's lay it all out, what we're going to cover today. We're diving into designing that NSXT network, the big role of the SDDC manager, the essentials for getting your workload domains up and running. Oh, and some smart ways to troubleshoot those network hiccups we all run into.
Of course, yeah.
And we're not stopping there. We've got automated lifecycle management, making those workloads move smoothly between environments.
Right.
We'll look at what makes the vRealize suite so powerful.
Okay.
Best practices for deploying VCF on-premises, and how to extend your reach into the public cloud with that hybrid cloud extension. Ready to get started?
Absolutely. Let's jump right in.
Okay, so let's start with that first question you sent over about architecting the NSXT network in VCF. The two big things that jumped out at me were setting up those transport zones correctly for your workload domains and making sure you've got redundant NSX edge nodes for high availability.
Right.
And the question specifically said, like, you don't want to just have a simple single-tier network or go with a basic VLAN structure.
Yeah.
Why are those two things, those transport zones and redundant edge nodes, so critical?
Well, if you think about it, those two pieces really get at some core networking principles. And in a virtualized environment like VCF, they're even more important.
Okay.
So those transport zones, those are all about creating these boundaries for your network traffic, right? Aligning it specifically with what your workload domains need. And you can think of it less like smoother travel,
Right.
and more about creating secure and efficient pathways for different types of data. You isolate that traffic,
Right.
and that actually helps you enhance security because you're limiting the blast radius of any potential issues.
Yeah.
But it also lets you optimize resource allocation for each workload.
So it's not just about avoiding collisions, it's about segmenting things properly from the get-go.
Exactly. And then those redundant NSX edge nodes, those are like your gatekeepers, right? Your service providers for the whole NSXT environment. They handle things like routing, firewalling, load balancing.
Right.
And when you deploy them in a redundant configuration, that's not just about preventing downtime if one fails.
Yeah.
It's about building resilience into the entire network fabric itself, making sure your critical apps and services are always available. So if one node goes down, the other one just takes over, no problem. Keeps everything running.
Okay, so it's like having that built-in safety net from the very beginning. Makes sense.
Yeah.
The second question we had was all about the SDDC manager. The key takeaway there was that it's responsible for managing and automating all the lifecycle operations for the entire VCF stack. But it specifically said it's not a storage controller, it's not directly managing your NSXT network, and it's not used for configuring those vSphere hosts directly.
Right.
So if it's not directly hands-on with every component, what's the big strategic advantage of having this centralized management?
If we zoom out a bit, think big picture.
Yeah.
The SDDC manager, it acts like the central control tower for your entire VCF environment. Think of it as the conductor, making sure that all the instruments, in this case vSphere, VSN, NSXT, even the vRealize suite, they're all playing in harmony.
Yeah.
And its advantage comes from that consistent and automated lifecycle management, streamlining everything. Deployment, configuration, monitoring, patching, upgrading, all of that across all your components.
Got it.
And that reduces human error, helps you stay compliant, and at the end of the day, gets that platform up and running faster, delivering value quicker.
So it's like having that single pane of glass to keep everything in sync, updated, all without having to juggle a bunch of different tools.
Right. That's the idea.
That's a huge time saver.
Yeah.
The third question we had drilled down into creating those workload domains. And it said the most essential component, you got to have, this is a set of ESXi hosts that meet those hardware compatibility requirements.
Right.
And it mentioned that things like VSN policies, a pre-configured vCenter, even a standalone NSXT deployment, those are important eventually, but they're not strictly required to actually create that initial workload domain. So why are those compatible ESXi hosts the absolute starting point? Like, why do they form that bedrock?
Well, that question really gets to the heart of VCF's architecture, because VCF is all about abstracting and managing compute, storage, and networking as this unified software-defined infrastructure, right?
Yeah.
And the ESXi hosts, those are your compute layer. They provide the raw processing power and memory that your virtual machines will actually run on.
Yeah, makes sense.
So think of them as the foundation that everything else gets built on. Without that compatible hardware to run ESXi, you can't even establish the necessary compute resources to build your workload domains. The other components, they come in later to define how those resources are used, managed, all of that. But those ESXi hosts, those are your non-negotiable starting point.
Got it. So you need the foundation before you can even start thinking about what you're going to build on top of it. Makes sense.
Right, exactly.
Okay, the fourth question threw us a curveball, a troubleshooting scenario with NSXT. It recommended that the first thing you should do is verify that you've got connectivity between your ESXi hosts and the NSX manager. And that makes sense intuitively, but why is that the top priority?
Okay, so this is where we have to understand the difference between the control plane and the data plane in NSXT. The NSX manager, that's your central brain, the control plane where all the configuration happens, the policies are defined, and then it pushes those configurations out to your ESXi hosts, and those edge nodes, which are operating in the data plane, actually forwarding traffic.
Got it.
So if your ESXi host can't talk to the NSX manager, they're not going to get those essential instructions, those policies.
Okay.
And that breakdown in communication, that leads to all sorts of network issues. So verifying that connection is step one. You got to make sure the brain can actually talk to the rest of the system before you even start thinking about other problems.
So it's like checking if the brain is even connected before you start trying to treat any of the symptoms.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Question 5 was all about the magic of automation, right? Automating those patches and upgrades.
Yes.
And it highlighted SDDC Manager Lifecycle Management as the key feature for managing updates for the whole VCF stack. It even pointed out that it's not VMware Area Operations, it's not vSphere Update Manager, it's not just the NSXT Upgrade Manager, it's this SDDC Manager Lifecycle Management. So this is our one-stop shop for keeping everything up to date and compatible.
Absolutely. Remember how we were talking about SDDC Manager being that orchestrator?
Yeah.
This is a perfect example. Tools like vSphere Update Manager, they're focused on vSphere. NSXT Upgrade Manager, that's just for NSXT. But SDDC Manager Lifecycle Management, it looks at the big picture. It coordinates the whole update process across all those integrated components, making sure everything stays compatible, avoiding those version mismatches that can cause headaches.
Got it.
VMware Area Operations, that's more about monitoring performance and capacity, not about actually doing the updates themselves.
Okay, so SDDC Manager is like our conductor, making sure all the instruments are playing the right notes, the updated note. I like that analogy. Okay, question 6 was about enabling workload mobility. And it emphasized two key things. First, you got to configure VMware HCX for those cross-cloud migrations. And second, you need to make sure your NSXT networking policies support Layer 2 extension.
Right.
Things like VSAN deduplication or even deploying vRealize automation, they weren't as directly relevant. So why are those two things, HCX and Layer 2 extension, so crucial for moving those workloads around smoothly?
Well, the big picture goal with workload mobility is to move those VMs, those applications between different environments, maybe on-premises to the cloud or even between on-premises data centers, and you want to do it with minimal disruption to the applications themselves.
Yeah.
HCX, that's what it's designed to do. It handles all the complexities of these cross-cloud migrations, kind of smooths over the differences in those underlying infrastructures. But for that migration to be truly seamless, you need that network to stretch between those environments. That's where that NSXT Layer 2 extension comes in. It lets you keep the same IP and MA addresses for your VMs even as you move them, so you don't have to re-IP anything. And that minimizes downtime, which is super important for a smooth transition.
So HCX is like the moving company, and Layer 2 extension is like making sure your mail still gets delivered to the same address even after you've moved.
Exactly. That's a great way to think about it.
Love that analogy.
Yeah.
Question 7 asked about the purpose of the VUI suite in VCF. And the answer said, it's all about providing that centralized logging, monitoring, and automation. And it clarified that while it might integrate with things like backup and disaster recovery or physical network management, or even enforcing those NSXT security policies, those aren't its main functions.
Yeah.
So what's the big value proposition here? What does the vRealize suite bring to the table?
The VLI suite, it's like your operational command center for the whole VCF environment. So SDDC Manager, that's focused on the life cycle of all those infrastructure components. But vRealize, it gives you the tools for ongoing visibility, optimization, and automation of the workloads and services that are running on that infrastructure. You've got things like vRealize Log Insight for centralized logging, vRealize Operations Manager for monitoring everything.
Okay.
And then you've got vRealize Automation and Orchestrator to handle the automation side of things.
Makes sense.
So it's really about managing the applications, optimizing how they're delivered, all built on that robust VCF foundation.
So SDDC Manager builds the engine, maintains it, and vRealize is the dashboard, the controls to drive and fine-tune everything.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
Question 8 zeroed in on best practices for on-premises deployments.
Yeah.
And it recommended 2 key things. First, have a dedicated management cluster separate from your workload clusters.
Right.
And second, configure those vSphere distributed switches for network traffic segmentation. And it said things like limiting your vSAN data stores or deploying NSXT before the workload domains. Those might not be as critical, maybe even limiting in some ways. So why are those 2 things, the isolated management cluster and the VDS, so important for a strong on-premises foundation?
It comes down to fundamental design principles, and this goes beyond just VCF.
Yeah.
By separating those management components, things like your vCenter server, the SDDC manager itself, those NSX managers, putting them on their own dedicated cluster, you're making your whole environment more secure and stable.
Right.
You're isolating those critical control plane components, so if something goes wrong in a workload cluster, it doesn't take down your whole management plane.
Right.
And then using those distributed switches, that gives you a consistent and centralized way to manage the networking across all your ESXi hosts within a cluster.
Got it.
And that lets you do really effective network traffic segmentation using VLANs and VXLANs, which improves performance by reducing contention and boosts security by separating different types of traffic.
Yeah. Makes sense. So it's about protecting the brains of the operation and making sure traffic flows smoothly and securely.
Exactly.
Okay, question 9 brought us back to automation. It reminded us that SDDC Manager is the tool for automating the creation and ongoing management of those workload domains. And it said that other components like the vSphere client, the NSX Manager, even vRealize Orchestrator, they all have different primary jobs. So SDDC Manager, that's our automation engine specifically built for workload domains.
Exactly. vSphere client, that's more for manual management, right?
Right.
And NSX Manager, that's focused on automating the network. But SDDC Manager, it was made to handle the entire life cycle of those workload domains.
Okay.
So it automates the provisioning of the compute, the storage, the networking, and it makes sure they all work together seamlessly.
Got it.
vRealize Orchestrator, that's a really powerful automation platform, no doubt. And it can work with VCF for sure. But SDDC Manager, it's got that built-in knowledge, those workflows that are designed specifically for those workload domains, from creation to decommissioning.
So for this specific task, managing those workload domains, SDDC Manager is the specialist, the go-to tool.
Right.
Okay, last question, question 10. This one was all about extending your on-premises VCF environment into the public cloud. And it highlighted VMware HCX as that critical feature for making that happen seamlessly.
Right.
And pointed out that other features like NSX edge clustering, vSAN stretched clusters, and VMware area automation, those serve different purposes. So when we talk about hybrid cloud with VCF, HCX is the key.
Absolutely. HCX is purpose-built to connect your on-premises data center and those public cloud environments.
Okay.
It makes migrating and managing workloads across those different infrastructures so much easier, whether you're talking about migrating virtual machines, extending your network, or even setting up disaster recovery.
Right.
And while those other technologies are important, NSX edge clustering, that's for high availability at the edge. vSAN stretched clusters, those give you high availability across different sites.
Yeah.
And VMware area automation, that's broader cloud automation, right? But HCX, that's the tool that tackles the complexities of actually extending VCF into the public cloud.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep exploring.
Yeah, keep learning.